Muslim women's roles in the religious domain, and particularly their roles as producers of religious knowledge. In what way do they play a role, especially Muslim women scholars? And how is that knowledge production related to also to particular projects that have to do with social justice and activism and reform of family laws and also reform of religious discourse, but from faith-based perspective? I think that some of our fuqaha also, revisited this idea of very gendered, divided parental roles. The father is the wali, the mother is the hadina. So even in our fiqh, there are these ideas and practices and legal opinions that allow for revisiting the question, and it's a contentious term. Sometimes, in some literature, Islamic feminism is understood as everything and anything that Muslim women do who are concerned with the question of gender equality. And I don't understand it that way. I use it as an analytical category, and I use it in order to study a number of women scholars, Muslim women scholars, across the board, different contexts, some of them in the global north, some of them in the global south, some of producing knowledge-based, religious knowledge that is also academic, but also based on a very close engagement with the textual tradition.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for joining to another Markfield Institute podcast. I'm delighted to say that I have with me today Dr. Mulki al-Sharmani. Professor Mulki al-Sharmani is Associate Professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Helsinki. She's published numerously on Islamic feminism using textual studies but also ethnographies. In particular, her latest monograph, Islamic Feminism, Hermeneutics and Activism, will be out in October, which we'll get into and discuss. But thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Mulki. It's a pleasure to have you. So to kick things off straight away, tell us a little bit about your research area. What areas do you deal with? What is your research area and what kind of things do you deal with?
First of all, Assalamu alaikum, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and thank you so much for the invitation. Happy to be here with you, Dr. Razwan, and to be here in Markfield Institute for Higher Education. So really, I started first working on modern family laws, Muslim family laws, and particularly their relationship to classical Islamic jurisprudence, focusing on the question of gender. I did a lot of ethnography in Egypt, in the Egyptian courts, and also investigating and talking to people about marriage and divorce norms and practices, and also talking to judges in family courts, sitting in the courts, talking to legislators, trying to understand the reform of modern family laws, but also how it is related to the question of religion, to the question of religious authority, interpretive authority. And that sort of led me to really investigate and get interested in Muslim women's roles in the religious domain, and particularly their roles as producers of religious knowledge. In what way do they play a role, especially Muslim women scholars? And how is that knowledge production related to also to particular projects that have to do with social justice and activism and reform of family laws and also reform of religious discourse, but from faith-based perspective? And so I started a project where I've been studying a number of scholar activists. Sometimes they are known as Islamic feminism. Some of the scholars, some of them have an issue with that term, but I can talk a little bit about
I think let's go straight into this then.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Islamic feminism. Obviously, can be a contentious term. How do you understand Islamic feminism?
Yeah.
How would you define it? How would you understand it?
Actually, that's a very good question. Thank you, Dr. Razwan, for asking that. And it's a contentious term. Sometimes, in some literature, Islamic feminism is understood as everything and anything that Muslim women do who are concerned with the question of gender equality. And I don't understand it that way. I use it as an analytical category, and I use it in order to study a number of women scholars, Muslim women scholars across the board, different contexts, some of them in the global north, some of them in the global south, some of producing knowledge-based, religious knowledge that is also academic, but also based on a very close engagement with the textual tradition, driven by the question of gender. So they are interested in the question of gender inequality and how to trace and unpack patriarchal interpretations that are used often to justify unequal laws and unequal norms, particularly in the marriage, but also in the public sphere, but also produce an alternative from within the textual tradition. And some of these women are also involved, so they produce this knowledge. They're academics, many of them based in universities, but they also are very much engaged in their communities. So they kind of like marry knowledge production with activism in their different contexts. So they are part of movement building. They work with religious scholars, with judges, with legislators, training students, trying to bring a conversation between those working on religion and those working on gender, and also very much trying to reform family law. So I study their engagements with these texts. And I also study their activism. And I've been focusing particularly on locally in Egypt, some of that happening, but also transnational Islamic feminism scholars all over in different countries.
It's really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about what kind of things you've kind of dealt with when you're talking about Islamic family law, especially with feminism? Like what was your research about? What were you looking at? What were the conclusions?
Yeah.
What did you kind of find?
Well, with the family law, I was interested primarily in, first of all, what is when we say reform of family laws, which is a very common.
And are we talking about modern family law, like as in state law in Egypt, places like this? Or are we talking about family law in terms of the like classical medieval jurisprudence? How?
Yes, thank you for that question. So, in fact, I work in two contexts, one minority context in Finland and the other one a Muslim majority context in Egypt. So and what I'm interested in and what I've been researching as far as family laws is concerned are first, yes, contemporary family laws like in Egypt, that is state code, it's codified, it's centralized, but it draws on the fiqh, is classical Islamic jurisprudence in a hybrid way, but very much you can see the fiqh concepts and the fiqh model of marriage there. And then when there are debates and efforts about changing the law over many years, by the way, since the law was codified in 1920, there are often a lot of debates about is this compatible with Islamic Sharia? Who has the authority to reform? How do we reform? And different also actors who have different agendas. So I'm interested also in the relationship between and a part of that debate involves these Islamic feminism scholars that I told you about that are producing religious knowledge, dealing with the question of gender and tafsir in Quranic tafsir, classical tafsir, but also Islamic schools, the different schools. And then also some of them also studying different other textual genres in our Islamic textual tradition, like Sufi principles. So they would be critically engaging with Islamic fiqh and how it's in a way demonstrated in modern family laws, but through Sufi principles that are traced to key theological questions in the Quran. So I'm interested in that intersection, what happens between people who are engaged in the textual tradition, but are very much driven also and working on modern issues having to do with family laws. And then I do the same thing in a minority context, like in Finland, where Islamic law is not codified, but we have Muslim communities who, conclude religious marriages, and as well as they need to register that marriage, and so they are kind of like navigating two legal systems, right? Yeah. Yes, and then there's the question of racism, question of Islam and Muslim as the other. And then and mosques play a role in family mediation, play a role in the conclusion of Islamic marriages. Then debates happen again about, okay, what is Islamic, what is compatible with Islamic Sharia, and then they intersect with the question of integration, the question of membership, meaningful membership in the Finnish society.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the research that you've done in Finland? Like, so
Okay.
what was the questions you were asking? What are the conclusions that you found?
Yeah. So it was a project, actually several years, about more than 4 years, and it was funded by the Academy of Finland project. And I was in charge of the main study, but I was also working with other colleagues, and it was ethnographic research. So what I did was I spent a lot of time in many mosques and really focused on the work they do in their family mediation. So how they conclude marriages.
And these are informal. I'm assuming these are informal in the sense that it's not to do with the state. It's
That's a good question. In Finland, because based on a certain model that has to do with the church and the state, mosques that are registered communities, if they have a license to conclude a religious marriage, then that marriage is
it's recognized by
recognized,
the state.
but it has to be notarized. But the only divorce issued by a Finnish civil court
Right.
is recognized. So usually you have some people who, and of course, in order to be able to register your marriage, you have to have residence. You have to prove that there are no obstacles to this marriage. For example, polygamy is not allowed, and so not everybody have those resources. But then I was interested. So I was interested in how the mosques were involved in marriage conclusion, but also family mediation. Like if someone wants and they want to get a divorce, they don't only get the civil divorce. They feel like in order to end their Islamic marriage, they need to get an Islamic divorce as well. So I was studying that, and particularly one mosque that was doing a lot of, family-based activities, trying to educate parents about fiqh of marriage, spousal roles, parental roles, and what kind of discourse they were promoting, how they were engaging, teaching people about classical fiqh and its relationship to their very modern lives and lived realities in that country. So that's what was one aspect of my research. The other aspect was I was concluding marriages, interviewing men and women who are getting married, who are divorced, who are engaged, and just looking at what are the marriage norms and practices that they adopt, and how do they, and I was interested not only in the practice, but what meanings do they give to practice, and particularly there, you have, with the women particularly, there was a lot of interest in gaining religious knowledge. So a lot of the women, take fiqh classes, tafsir classes, Quran classes that are offered by these mosques. So there was also a lot of pursuit of religious knowledge, and often that had an impact and a role to play in how these women would make choices about marriage. So that was what I was doing in Finland.
What is the makeup of the Muslim community in Finland? So
Yeah, Finland, of course, it's a small country. We're about like 5.5 million, and the Muslim community is still very small. It's a little less than 1% actually, but it's like expanding. And it for the most the history of Finland, Finland has been a country sending people out. There were a lot of Finnish going to other countries like in Sweden or in even America. But then they started receiving a lot of refugees. Most of that migration is refugee based. The oldest Muslim community is the Tatar coming from Russia.
Right.
They're very small in number, but then we got a very large, now more expanding Muslim communities, very diverse: Somalis, Iraqis, Syrians, definitely after 2015, Afghanis, Turkish, and so on. So then now there's a very visible Muslim community. And then the question of Muslim and Islam and the need of Muslim communities have become even more important.
That's very interesting. No, thank you. So let's move on to the kind of Islamic feminism part, which is a kind of a core part of a lot of your research and what you publish, and also this new book that's due to be published. let's talk first about methodology of Islamic feminism. I mean, what does that actually look like in terms of methodology? How do we
Yeah.
go about what makes it Islamic feminism even?
Yes.
In fact, what are your views on the label Islamic feminism?
Yes.
Like, yeah, what are your thoughts on?
Yes. That's very,
Yeah.
very good question. For me, in my work, I think it's very important that I define it, and I'm using it analytically, because some of these even scholars that I'm studying, some of them refuse that term,
Yeah, I
you
know.
know, like
Yeah.
Asma Barlas.
Yeah.
But for a reason, you know, for her, it's, you know, it has this entanglement with colonial history and colonial feminism that often subjugated the brown men and black men in the name of saving and emancipating their women, and Egypt, a very good case, other places as well. So I don't call them feminist
Right.
particularly, hence, you know, I'm not putting that identity on them, but it's Islamic feminism. And the way I understand it is Islamic because their work is very serious, meticulous, consistent engagement with different sciences in textual traditions. So some of them work on tafsir, some of them work on the Quran and the tafsir, some of them are working on Islamic fiqh, some of them are working on Sufism, some of them also work on different genres. So it's Islamic because these women are critically, but also engaging with their textual tradition very seriously. But at the same time, it is faith based. And they don't shy away from that. They are academics, but they say that their starting point is that they are believing Muslims. Their premise is, for example, the Quran is the word of God, is divine, um, and the question of gender is what drives them. So they are interested in unpacking, deconstructing patriarchal interpretations found in our textual tradition, but also understanding how they were formed, what methodologies were used, and then how do they shape understandings now, and particularly in the family laws, right? But then there, and that's what I call part of their methodology, which has to do with deconstructing these patriarchal interpretations. And the other part that interests me, and which I also is related to the Islamic part, what is Islamic about them, is I argue they are engaged in constructive theology. So the question of gender, it doesn't stop at gender. So the gender becomes a lens into which they really explore very important theological and ethical questions in Islamic faith, you know, like Tawheed. How do we understand Tawheed? How do we understand Al-Haq as one of the names of God? But is it more than that? How do we understand the idea that marriage is mithaq ghaliz? Is it, how do we systematically study Quran as an ethical discourse? So I see also the Islamic part is the way they are also having a conversation and trying to have a contribution to theological questions, though driven by gender, theological questions, ethical questions. And in fact, I see their academic contribution in that area very relevant to other academic works now that are being done, focusing on studying systematically Quranic ethics by other scholars who are not working on gender. So that's the Islamic part. The feminist part, feminism, for me, it has several layers. One is they understand and apply feminism the way I analyze their work as epistemology, as a methodology. It's about how do we know what we know? What's the relationship between knowledge and interpretive authority? And that also as a methodology in terms of, like, you know, when one example is one of these scholars is Umayma Abu Bakr. She does this genealogical reading of the concept of Qawamun, you know, which occurs in Surah An-Nisa, verse 34. But then how this Qawamun over 10 centuries of tafsir became a patriarchal concept. Qiwam are not understood as responsibility, but as authority, male authority and male superiority, and how it is used now in modern family laws and many Muslim debates as a way to argue against certain reforms, even when they come from an Islamic textual tradition, just by using that concept. So I find that it's a methodology. I see it as a feminist methodology that is grounded in the religion, in the tradition, because she's doing a genealogical tradition. She's not imposing anything, but it's a particular kind of a methodology that hence, so the feminist part also has to do with how they read the text. This holistic reading of the Quran, part of it, and tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, that comes from the tradition, but they take a step further and use also eclectic methodologies. And then the third dimension of why it's feminist for me is that certainly they are involved in social justice projects. So it's not just the knowledge of production of academic knowledge for the sake of academic knowledge. They are involved in collective efforts, in movement building. They work with religious scholars, with women's rights organizations. Some of them work together globally. And in fact, a disclaimer, part of that, it's a movement, for example, Musawa, I'm part of it, but I also study it critically. And it brings together many of these academics and activists, all Muslim, trying to produce research-based knowledge.
Could you tell us a little bit about Musawa? So what
Yes.
exactly?
So it's as the name indicates, it's an Arabic name, means equality. And it was it's a network of academics and lawyers and activists from all over the world. And it was launched in 2009. So from Malaysia, from Egypt, from UK, from Indonesia, all over the world, Africa, Muslims. And then the aim is it's a knowledge building movement. That's how we define ourselves. And it's about undertaking research projects, producing knowledge academically. So we, do research projects that take several years. And also our approach is four-pronged, so we work on Islamic teachings and we take a holistic approach. So we don't just work on tafsir. We bring together people, academics, and we work on the different religious sciences because we believe also they have to be in conversation with another. So we work on the usul, on the tafsir, on the hadith, on the practices of fiqh of marriage before the nation state, on modern family laws, and we do empirical research looking at how men and women are living marriage in different Muslim contexts. Primarily, it's been Muslim majority context, and then we produce knowledge, i.e. books, but we don't stop there. So we do training where we do all over the countries where we do training workshops trying to read and understand our religious texts from a gender perspective. And so we work with family court judges, with lawyers, with university students. Just before I came here, we were doing an online workshop with some colleagues from Pakistan. We also do it in person. And then we also, from this academic knowledge, we produce these policy briefs and also podcasts and videos because we want to engage also with the general public, right? And we try to do it in different languages. So because we are also aware of the global inequalities. So we don't want to do everything just in English. So we produce work also in Arabic and other languages.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. So a question, the next question I want to touch upon is if you could maybe look at a case study of what you've discussed about Islamic feminism, the classical tradition, but also that link with the modern. So you mentioned qawama, for example, right? We can use that as an example, just so we understand this a little bit better. So traditionally for 34, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Based on your studies and what you've done, what actually happens with, so is it a study of the interpretation from the medieval early period of qawama, what does that mean, to the modern, how is that term understood? What is the process that's taking place in understanding qawama as a case study, for example?
So in 2000, the Egyptian legislature passed this law, khula law. It's a judicial divorce, and it makes the husband's consent irrelevant. So a wife can petition for khula to the court, and and then she doesn't. It's a no fault, so she doesn't have to prove. It's not prejudicial divorce. She doesn't have to prove harm. But she, as based on the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, so she says, I fear that I will transgress against the limits of Allah, and I don't want to be in this marriage anymore. And she gives up the financial dues. She gives back the dower, and also gives up her financial dues. Now, when this divorce law was proposed, there was a big backlash against it, and there still is now, although things have changed. And one of the very key arguments we heard in the debates from religious scholars, but also regular people, this contravenes qawama, and qawama understood as, first of all, divine, God-given, and also understood as men's right, men's authority. Men are the ones who could unilaterally repudiate. And then there were these arguments that they are, like morally superior, they are intellectually superior. They are the ones who can make that decision that this is not right, right? And there was a big backlash, and even some Azhar scholars, the establishment as a whole, agreed with it, but some religious scholars even wrote a letter resisting it and being opposed to it. Now, someone I've studied, but also I worked with and I co-authored with, like Umayma Abu Bakr. So when she did this study of 10 centuries of how this Qawamun became a patriarchal construct, in the classical tafsir, starting from At-Tabari all the way to Muhammad Abdu, you understand clearly how we now understand qawama in some very common Muslim discourses as male authority and superiority. So you have At-Tabari explaining it as, okay, it's still descriptive, it's okay, but he says it's more like a man disciplining his wife. As Zamakhshari starts compiling these qualities, he is like, her using even these languages of that he is the Ra'is, he is the ruler, and and she is the subject, and then using justifying it, presenting, interpreting it as a superiority, but also using attributes like, okay, because men can do jihad, men can do the takbir, because men lead the prayer, and then also using a circular argument, because men can divorce, therefore they have qawama, and they have qawama because they can divorce. And then as you go along, Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir then linking it to even Surah Al-Baqarah, the one about Ad-Daraja in 2 to 8. And then we come all the way to Muhammad Abdu, and then starting using a different kind of patriarchy, modern patriarchy. Well, it's about the fitra. Women are domestic beings. They are meant to be at home. They are, and more like even, it comes even from a little bit more from a Victorian discourse, they are homemakers. They are very good at tadbir al-manzili, and men intrinsically are made for leadership, for public sphere, and explaining qawama again as riyasa. So that kind of study, I think, is very important, because on the one hand, it critically engages with the texts, with the tafsir. It's not about knocking down the tafsir, but it's trying to understand a genealogy of a certain idea.
So
And
how these ideas are being developed.
exactly. And also trying to understand, which is very important, I think, the distinction between also modern patriarchy and pre-modern patriarchy, which is very important. So it's important in that sense. And then seeing the traces now, in what way people don't even question it now. And you just simply can say, hey, this is against qawama. It has somehow become part of the cultural understanding. So in a way, when someone like her unpacks that and explains it, and she's done it in an academic work, but then the activist part, she is part of the co-founder of this NGO research center, actually called Women in Memory Forum in Egypt, Al-Mar'a al-Zakira. And there's another one, Islamic feminist scholar in Egypt, who writes only in Arabic and really addresses, Umayma writes in Arabic and English, Amani Saleh. She writes in Arabic. She only focuses on the Arab speakers. She doesn't write in English. And she also has written about the Qiwama. And then both of them, what they do is also, they've been working since 2000 and after the 2011 uprising, with religious scholars, with NGOs, and really produced these booklets where they disseminate this very complex academic ideas in clear, accessible language to general public so that they can be discussed. Another thing they've done is they were working with this NGO, MEDA Foundation is called, after the Egyptian Revolution, where they were doing training with mosque imams and saying, okay, how can you do khutbah? How can you revisit and engage with your textual tradition? Probably the imams know very well, but from a gender perspective. And what would that add for you?
And what is the reception? Like, this is what I want.
Yeah.
What's the reception of that?
In Egypt?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it's mixed. It's mixed. Some are receptive to it. The religious scholars, like, I'll give you an example, Dr. Razwan. So I was studying what Umayma Abu Bakr, she's the co-founder of Mar'a al-Hadara, Al-Mar'a al-Dhakira, Women and Memory, and this Amani Saleh is also, heading this another NGO called Al-Mar'a al-Hadara. And they do these, knowledge and so on. And by the way, Umayma's NGO is not only by herself. There are other scholars as well, and they are primarily interested in, like unearthing Arab women's roles in history. But Umayma's part is very much concerned with religious texts, right? So anyway, I was attending, observing, researching a collaboration that they were doing through this MEDA Foundation, an NGO, with Azhar scholars. It was in Alexandria. It was, I believe, 2016 or something like that. And part of it was 3-day meetings, all of us together. And the first one was on the agenda was also discussing what is Islamic feminism in Arabic, and Niswa al-Islami. And there was a lot of pushback from the Azhar scholars. What is this in Niswa al-Islamiyya? But then once some of these assumptions were gotten out of the way, and they started talking about the text, about the lived realities of women and men, there was more productive conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
What are some of the, like, at a grassroots level, when we're talking about issues that are being dealt with, like, for example, Musawa or all of this, sometimes these conversations can be quite abstract, and hence it becomes quite contentious. But clearly Musawa, or when you talk about Islamic feminism, is dealing with a lived reality. There are concerns that need to be addressed. There's a feeling. What are these concerns? I mean, just to so what are some of these concerns that are being dealt with as a lived reality?
Yeah, I mean, so there are these two dimensions. So there's the Islamic feminist part that has to do with scholarship, production of academic knowledge, books, and so on, based on many years of research and so on. And then there's the other level where some of these scholar activists are like, for example, part of Musawa, focusing on Muslim family law. So some of the concerns are specifically, for example, the issue of child marriage, the issue of unequal right to divorce, the issue of a very important issue is the guardianship, so parenting, parental roles. So it's still in many countries, there's it's based on the classical fiqh model where parenting is seen in a gendered way. The father is the wali, the mother is the hadina. Now, sometimes even before the marriage breaks down, problems arise because of that model, because it doesn't reflect reality. So if a mother wants to open account for her bank account for her their child, or needs to transfer the child from one school to the other, even when the marriage is still established, she has to get permission from the husband, and which complicates things. And then the assumption also is, like, for example, let's say in Egypt, the assumption is it's the father who is only primarily in charge of the education, the moral upbringing. Of course, the father has a big role to play, but it doesn't, and also that he has no role to play in the physical care, in the nurturing care. And first of all, that
so it's like a binary almost.
Exactly. And that is in our classical fiqh.
Right.
But that, on the one hand, it is not in the best interest of the children, number one. And a lot of empirical work has proven that. And number two, it makes the day-to-day parenting of children very, very difficult, extremely difficult. And then if there's a divorce, and it's an acrimonious divorce, yeah, it becomes even more difficult, because if the mother is the custodial, and usually that's the case, and depending on which school they follow, right, for a certain number of years, then and if they don't have a good relationship, then she cannot really parent or take care of that child without the. So for example, in Egypt, they did a little bit of changes where she has the custodial divorced mother has educational guardianship, but not everything, right? So she can manage the educational affairs of her children, but not other things. Like if there's an emergency and they need to, have a medical issue, she can't deal with that. And if the relationship is
So
acrimonious,
it's literally waiting for the father. If there was a medical issue, the mother wouldn't really have
yes, yes.
And is that a legal thing, or is that more from a
It is in the law,
Yeah.
but the law reflects the fiqh model.
Right, of course.
The fiqh model. And the weird thing is, so there's this scholar called Ibrahim Fikri. His name is Ibrahim Fikri, Ahmed Ibrahim Fikri, and he was based in University of Toronto. I don't know where he is, but he did this excellent work where he looked at before the nation state in Egypt. How people managed their affairs of parenting their children. And he noticed that a lot of these parents, although in theory, the fiqh book says, your father, you are the wali, the mother, you are the hadina. But actually, these judges,
Is this pre-modernity we're talking about?
we're talking about 16th century,
Okay.
up to, I believe it was 17. It was before the nation state, and it was Ottoman period, but there was, and no codified, right? So the parents would go to the court and they would agree on arrangements where, sometimes the father would have the child, he would take it, and this is if they're divorced, or the mother would do it. It was much, much more flexible, and the judges took into account what worked for a family, right? And he reviewed these court practices, these deeds, especially with the Ottomans, we have a wealth of these historical records. And he found also the same thing that some of our fuqaha also, revisited this idea of very gendered, divided parental roles. The father is the wali, the mother is the hadina. So even in our fiqh, there are these ideas and practices and legal opinions that allow for revisiting the question.
And these are legal judgments. These are actual practical legal judgments that would happen in a Sharia court in the 16th or 17th century. And it's a lot more nuanced. It's not...
Exactly. And even some fiqh opinions, even in the books, they were willing to go there. But what happens in the modern period is that not many people have knowledge of that nuances and that changes and the differences among the fuqaha, right? Of course, they had a patriarchal model. That's okay. But they had in mind also the interest of the family and the lived realities, and they were flexible, and there was room for a difference. Whereas what happens now when it becomes part of a state law,
because it's codified, right? At that point,
exactly. It is state law. It is codified. You don't have that space for al-ikhtilaf, and it is enforced through state machinery, and the other layer of
so it's just a bit ironic, though. So we're saying in pre-modernity, it's a lot more flexible than after. In some ways,
yes.
Because it wasn't codified. So it would be a case of somebody going to a qadi, having this issue, and the qadi would look at the situation, and there would be a nuance in how the qadi would judge. Whereas now, because it's codified, it's a lot more restrictive.
Exactly.
That's quite interesting.
Exactly, and then also the nature of the fiqh changes.
Yeah.
The nature of the fiqh, because Islamic law, also Islamic legal tradition, is multidimensional. So you have the fatwa, you have these court cases, and then the fuqaha, as we know, also had no problem revisiting their opinions. So so you had Malki jurists in Egypt disagreeing with their counterparts, Malki jurists in Medina, because Egypt required something else. And they had no problem with that. And we have historical records that show that. Like one example is how sadaq is paid. Should it be, in Egypt, there's been this practice of prompt and deferred dower, right? Whereas some of these Malki jurists in Medina would say, hey, you can't do that. Dower isn't, it's due to the wife. The marriage is concluded. She gets her dower. But in Egypt, because it was also farming, Sometimes people could not have the husband have that ready. So there was a part that was deferred. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Professor Mulki, let's go on to your book now. I want to talk about your book, which is due to be published in October. It's entitled Islamic Feminism, Hermeneutics and Activism. Tell us a little bit about this book. What do you cover? What are the ideas? What do you argue?
Yes. So it's based on Academy of Finland project, the funded project, and I spent like about 5 years doing the research. It's based both on textual and ethnographic research. So basically, what I do is, as it's mentioned in the title, I am trying to study systematically Islamic feminist hermeneutics. So I focus on a selected scholars, and what I do is I try to study their works in conversation with one another. So I study Amina Wadud, Asma Barlos. I also study Kishi Ali and Ziba Mir Husseini and Umayma Abu Bakr and Asma Lambrabit and Amani Saleh and Naveen Rida and Saadiya Sheikh. And I study also some of these, for example, like Umayma Abu Bakr and Asma Lambrabit. I study also their work in Arabic. And someone like Amani Saleh, I study her work completely in Arabic because she doesn't write in English. And what's important for me is to bring them into conversation with one another. So I'm interested in, first of all, what is their scholarship about? What is the goal? What are their premises? And some of these people have been working on this for several decades. So I also follow the trajectory, the development in their ideas, and I'm also interested in the fact that they work on different texts. So some of them are primarily focused on Quran, like Amina Wadud. Some of them work on the Quran and tafsir, like Umayma Abu Bakr, Asma al-Amrabit, Naveen Rida. Some of them, like Naveen Rida, she also works on usul al-fiqh. Someone like Umayma Abu Bakr, she works on the tafsir, on the Quran, but she does also work on biographical dictionaries, looking at women as muhaddithat and so on. And then some of them, like Ziba Mir Husseini and Kishi Ali, really into Islamic legal tradition. Saadiya Sheikh, Sufism. So I'm interested in, if we bring their works together hermeneutically, what can we learn from it in terms of how they engage with the text? How do they bring different textual sciences in conversation with one another? What are their goals, right? And therefore, I'm interested in, is there such thing as Islamic feminist hermeneutics? Would it look like? What are specific methodologies, right? How is it applied? So I do a very careful study of their approaches and specifically how they read certain texts, what interpretations they do, how they've changed in their thoughts. So the first part is really about the hermeneutics.
And what are some of the conclusions from that first part?
Which is something I mentioned earlier. So I look about how they, broadly speaking, some of them do this deconstruction, like they're trying to unpack certain patriarchal interpretations, working these different texts, and tell us how they came about, right? And how do they do it also? I'm interested in how they do it. And then I'm interested in the second part is like, okay, who's doing also constructive theology, what I call. And in there, I look at two things. One is how they reread the so-called gender verses. Okay, so Umayma told us how Qawamun became Qiwama as a male authority. But okay, how are they rereading these verses? Daraja, Qawamun, polygamy, divorce. What readings are they offering? Right? And not only in the tafsir, also the fiqhs, like Naveen Rida has work on ijma'. How can we revisit ijma'? What do we do with usul al-fiqh? She has this concept of approaching the Quran as a spiritually integrative method, right? So I look at that constructive part, but then I'm interested not only how they reread gender verses. I spend quite a bit of time in the book about how they go into particular theological make certain theological contributions and ethical contributions, like, for example, the question of Tawheed in Amina Wadud. I think that's very interesting, this idea that Tawheed, okay, yes, it's about believing in God. And of course, a lot of our previous scholars, past scholars, have written about the Tawheed. But also, what does it mean when she says Tawheed also means if you enact it as a social praxis, it can be a principle that can really be the basis for egalitarian, just society. Not just about gender, right? Like the Tawheed, if we really understand it as so I'm interested in
Like you
how
were
she
saying,
gets
it's
that.
more than just gender as
Exactly. And someone like Amani Saleh spent a lot of time working on this concept of al-haq, and others, like Umayma Abu Bakr, like, for example, in Surah Al-Rahman, she really looks at the relationship between aesthetics in the Quran and ethics, right? And what Quran has to say about the nature and the nature of God. How is also that related to its ethical messages, and she's interested also in the question, which is relevant to Islamic liberation theology, although she doesn't use that concept, is the question of not doing zulm, and about protecting the vulnerables, and how the Quran has real concern for the vulnerable, the marginalized, the oppressed, right? So I'm interested in that. So I do that, but I'm also in conversation with those who critique this kind of scholarship, and there has been a lot of critique
So what are
of
some
it.
of these? What do you kind of look into? What
Like, for example, and the critique comes from different
angles?
actors
Yeah.
and
Okay.
angles,
Okay.
and which is interesting to engage with. So there are those, for example, Aisha Hidayatullah, who actually was a student of one of these main Islamic feminist scholars, Kishi Ali, and her PhD was on Islamic feminism, but she produced this book where she is very critical now, Islamic, and her point is that these scholars are simply reading into Quran modernist ideas of gender equality, and in order to make the case of gender equality, you need to radically revisit your that's Hidayatullah's approach. Radically revisit the Quran as a source of norms, and how do you understand the Quran as as a textual source, so I'm interested in that kind of, those who say, hey, this is just a modernist reading, you're not really making the case, and I engage with that critique, right? And then there are those who say, well, methodologically you are departing from the tradition. You are, what is this genealogical reading over 10 centuries? You are not, in what way you are claiming, which these scholars do, that this is also a conversation from within, that from within the tradition. There are those who saying, first of all, some of these scholars are trained in Islamic studies. And they all know their textual stuff very well, but there are those who say, well, you are trained in secular universities. You're based in these secular universities. You're not traditionally trained. What authority do you have? And you are now adopting these eclectic methodologies and so on. So there's that. And then there are those, who say, you are kind of like, you're looking, you are basically dismantling the tradition. You are, and there are those who adopt a decolonial critique, who say, um, basically, you are reproducing a liberal idea of emancipation and women's gender equality, and that is really alien to the tradition. So I unpack all of these critiques, but also look at what can we learn from them, and where are the blind spots, and so on,
So
and
what
how
are
can we categorize them.
So so how, if we had to kind of go in a little bit deeper, so what would you say are some of these blind spots? How do you kind of
I mean, I think they, on the one hand, they are useful because, in the sense that what we can learn from them is that these critics spend time studying these different scholars. So they are useful because some of them came up with ways of classifying these works, and and what these works have done, and what they have contributed. So on that level, they provide something because they give us an understanding at what these scholars have done. I think that is important. But then and also some of them note, I mean, a new scholar was actually, he's a young new PhD, a good colleague. We learn from each other. We disagree with each other, and we learn from each other. Uh, he studied with Shuruq Nagib, actually, and his name is Mahmoud Afifi, I believe. I'm blanking on the last name, although he's a very good colleague, and I write about him. So his question was also, he was criticizing this idea about how Asma Barlas and Amina Wadud, um, how do they somehow approach the Quran and understand and make a distinction between patriarchal tafsir and the Quran, and somehow the Quran has the answers,
And the tafsir
and the
doesn't.
tafsir
Tafsir is the
doesn't.
problem.
That's
Yeah.
how Mahmoud is reading them, but also, and then he goes further and says, and somehow they have, in a way, it's their interpretation of the Quran, but also he goes into these ideas about like how they are. On the one hand, they're kind of drawing on Mu'tazilite the ideas, but they're not really engaging there, and they are doing it superficially. And his argument also is that they are imposing some of notions of from Western scholars who worked on hermeneutics, because he traces. Because some of these Islamic feminist scholars are influenced by Fazlur Rahman's work. And he says, okay, Fazlur Rahman was influenced by these scholars, therefore they must be influenced by these scholars. Uh, so I look at Mahmoud's critique. I think one thing, I disagree with him on a number of things, and I do that, but one thing I think that is useful, that his critique notes, is also, have these scholars, i.e. Islamic feminist scholars, have they worked on ilm kalam? And that's a fair critique. They have not, and so that's an interesting thing. Okay, do they need to go there? How would they go there systematically? So my point is not just to kind of like debunk it, but no, try to really shed light on what we can learn from these critics, but also have a conversation with them about the blind spots. So that's the critique part. Then the second part, I really look at the activism.
Okay.
So I look at what's happening in Egypt. What are they?
Is it case studies? Are you looking
It's a
at
case studies. Okay.
So what kind of case studies are
like I study in detail, like especially since the 2013, which is when I started the project, in Egypt, like how have these particular two Islamic feminist scholars who are very well known in Egypt, but what have they been doing in terms of actual activism, how their ideas have been used and how they've imparted it through particular things that they've been doing with Al-Azhar, with women's rights organization, and then really locating it within particularly Egypt after the revolution and the derailed revolution and Muslim Brotherhood rule, and then Sisi's rule, and what was going on there, and as well as the challenges and to what extent it's impactful. What are they doing with university students, with Azhars, because they also engage with young Azharites. So that's one case study which I go into in detail. And then the other one is Musawa. What's happening in Musawa as well, and in what way this Islamic feminist knowledge is translatable in particular activism in Musawa over 15 years now. 15 years, and as well as the challenges and the limitations.
Okay. So, and how does the kind of the ethnography part link with the kind of the textual part? Like how does that work?
That's a very good question, and it's actually one question that I got early on when I submitted the book proposal. Should these be
because often they're very separate things.
Yes.
It's not very common to see an ethnography and a kind of a textualist-based methodological study being merged into one work. We often see them as two separate things.
Absolutely.
So it's really interesting to see that actually you've put them both together. So how does it kind of work?
I think this is a very relevant question, and in fact, early on when I was submitting the book proposal to these publishers, one of the anonymous reviewers I got was, okay, can you make the case? How do they fit together? And for me, they are relevant. They connect. How? Because the way I understand their work and also what they do is that these are scholar activists. So, because I'm not, there are a lot of other Islamic feminism. I'm studying specific people who are also engaged in, if you want to use political in a broad sense, i.e. political towards focus on social justice. They are producing knowledge, but they're also really engaged with different actors in their local context, but some of them even on the global level, where they are doing these organized collective activities and aimed at certain goals, right? Whether it's working with Sharia judges, whether it's working with mosque imams, whether it's working on a position paper with the Azhar, and so the reason why I do this part is that I am very much interested in how these ideas travel or not. Whatever they produce in the academic work, in
How
what
much
way
is that is
exactly, in what way it has resonance, in what way, and also and it's two ways, in what way also their local context and their lived realities inform and feed into their academic work, because many of these scholars, not all of them, but quite a few of them, like Amina Wadoud, like Saadiya Sheikh, who's also very much involved in activism in South Africa, what they believe also, and they argue that lived experience is a very important lens through which also to understand laws, texts, religious texts, that is, right? Hence, I think these two are very important. It's a two-way thing. So, and in order to study this, I needed to do this ethnographic research, and I was lucky to have this like 5-year funding where I traveled a lot, where I was able to really observe and sit in their workshops, interview them, talk to people who are engaging with them, and so on, as well as see pushbacks, in real time. Scholars religious scholars and legislators and some policymakers who are pushing back and saying, hey, I don't agree with this, and so on.
Okay, so could you give us an example of this kind of construction, that leading on from the book, or maybe a case study or an example of what that looks like or has happened, or
Yeah.
any other works?
Right. So on the one level, that is what these scholars do in terms of putting forward ideas about theological principles or rereading gender verses. Now, on the praxis level, I've studied, a relevant example would be like in Musawa, this research project that we did for about more than 5 years, where a number of academics worked together, and we were interested in exploring what would be ethical and legal model for a marriage of equal partnership from within the tradition. So we brought together academics with the expertise in the relevant texts, that is textual knowledge, people working on usul, people working on Quran and tafsir, people working on the practice of Islamic law, historical studies, that is, on modern family laws, on Sufism. We had Saadiya Sheikh on, and then and it took several years, of course, and then we came up with this edited volume.
What's the name of this volume?
It's called Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage, Building Egalitarian Ethics and Jurisprudence of Marriage. And it was published by One World. So there you had textual, socio-legal, and historical studies. And also we had colleagues like Mariam Al-Attar, who's Islamic studies Islamic philosophy and focus on Islamic philosophy and Islamic ethics, also working on Islamic ethics. And the running theme is the question of gender, but the broader question is the relationship between ethics and law.
Right.
And for us, that's an example of reconstruction. So, are there modalities? And we're not arguing, hey, there's this one answer. We've come up with the one answer. No, but we're also interested in very much in the how. So you have, for example, Professor Mohsen Kadivar, Iranian scholar, also trained as a jurist, based at Duke University. So he looks at usul. Niveen Reda looks at usul al-fiqh. Okay, can you address that question on the level of usul? Shadab Rahmatullah and Sarah Ababna, they have a chapter looking at the Sunnah and focus on the Seerah particularly, and the marriage of Khadija radiallahu anha and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what can we learn from that marriage, as a model for new kind of masculinity and manhood. So I think that would be an example of reconstruction, and particularly focusing on the methodology and not saying here's the answer, but here are the frameworks that are possible. And for us, it's very important that, again, it's holistic in the sense is that you look at all the different sciences in our textual tradition, bring them into conversation together. Now, the second component of that research, which is now taking place, it's been taking place for a couple of years now, and I'm leading it with other colleagues in Musawa, Professor Ziba Mir Husseini and others, is ethnographic research where because of funding problems, we can't do it in many countries, but we're doing it in 4 countries. So we want to learn from lived realities on the ground. What are people trying to change about marriage norms and practices? And by people, not only women and men who live, who are getting married, divorced, but also legislatures, religious scholars. So there are particular initiatives happening in these 4 countries, and we're interested in learning from the ground. So what are the ideas that people have about what is wrong with marriage, Muslim marriage that is, what needs to be changed, and what are the collective initiatives as well as individual lived experiences that tell us something. And we're focusing on Pakistan, Somaliland, Egypt, and Indonesia.
Fantastic. So it's a lot of studies there, a lot of things that have been
Yes.
done. I suppose to kind of wrap up the conversation, the last thing I'd probably ask you is, what's your future plans for research? Where is there specific things you're looking into now? Inshallah, when the book will be out in October, and you've worked on all of these things. What's the next steps?
Well, there's this ethnographic research happening in these 4 countries, so there will be publications that we need to do on that. So, I'm also doing the research in Egypt with the researcher who's there. And then I have applied for some grants with colleagues from different countries, inshallah, if we are fortunate and we get the grant, it will be like a it's a collaborative research project that will involve several of us based in UK, in South Africa, and in Australia, and in other countries, where we look at Islamic law, traditional Islamic law related to modern family laws. And we're interested on one part, like revisiting the doctrine itself and the ahkam, and the other part also more related to modern practices. So it's a more in-depth study into Islamic law. That's one idea. The one project, we'll see what happens. The other one is we're still at the beginning. We are doing the brainstorming with some colleagues of mine, including Naveen Rida and others, and we will be applying for grants and trying to do more into a very systematic study of Quranic ethics.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
But we'll see.
Thank you very much, Professor Mulki al-Sharmani. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here today, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Razwan. It was a pleasure.